All right, today we're going to be talking about one of the more common biogeochemical cycles, and that is the water cycle. As water cycle, as we talk about the biogeochemical cycles, that we're talking about things that move through both the living world and then the earth, right? So we've got bio, and then we've got geo, which is the earth, and then the chemical. And so water is a molecule that's going to be moving around. Water is constantly being recycled from the atmosphere, from the oceans, from the land, from other bodies of water, and it's just constantly moving around, taking different forms. Sometimes it's ice, sometimes it's rain, sometimes it's sitting in a body of water for a long time. So water has been and will continue to move around the earth. So we're going to look at some of the ways in which water can move around the planet. So we're going to look at our diagram here. One of the first ways there's really no order because it's a cycle, right? So one of the first things we're going to look at is simply evaporation. And water is going to evaporate out of a body of water, and that's going to just simply change it from a liquid to a gas state. So here in our body of water, evaporation is just going to be moving up into the atmosphere, again, going from liquid water to a water vapor state. And that happens a lot. Evaporation is happening all the time. It happens in the ocean, as the sun's beating down. And there's a different form of evaporation we'll talk about a little bit later, which is specific to plants and has a little bit different name. But again, that's one of the first steps, is to take bodies of water and turn that into a vapor form. And so there's a lot of water in the air, depending on where you're at and where you're located. If you're in an area that is arid, then you're going to notice there's not nearly as much water vapor in the air, and your air is going to be drier. Maybe that dries out your skin. So if you're in an area that's desert-like or something along like that, you're not going to notice very much water. Also, it depends on the season, right? So if you're in an area, let's say it's the spring and it's rainy and it's hot. If you go outside, and you've ever noticed this, and you probably won't notice it as much in the spring, but you'll notice it in my winter example. So you go outside and you're outside, you're making noise, and it just kind of seems like the sound doesn't go that far, right? Like maybe you clap your hands and you hear it, but it doesn't just echo forever, right? And then you do the same thing after, let's say, a snowstorm, and you go outside and you're marching around in the snow and you clap your hands and it just seems to echo forever. That's because in the wintertime, the air is very, very dry. That sound of you clapping your hands is going to continue to move through the air because there's not a lot of moisture to muffle it, right? In the spring, when there's a lot of water in the air, right, plants are evaporating water, transpiring water, there's a lot of water in the air, and so that sound just kind of hits those water droplets or that water vapor in the air and it deadens it. In the wintertime, when things like when snow falls or like a tree limb cracks or something like that, it seems to echo forever. That's because you take away all that water, and it allows that sound to move a lot faster. So that's just kind of an example there of where you have water in the air versus not having water in the air. So evaporation, again, it's happening all the time. We're taking water out of rivers, out of lakes, out of ponds, out of oceans, and getting it up into the atmosphere. During this process, impurities that are in the water are left behind. So it's not like a full distillation where we were actually boiling the water and getting everything out. But a lot of the impurities are going to be left behind. And so the water is going to be cleaner in the form of water vapor than it was on the earth. So this is a form that helps purify water. Once the water gets up into the atmosphere, the next thing that it can go through is a process called condensation. And this is the opposite of evaporation. Condensation occurs when the gas is changed into a liquid. So we're going to have condensation here, and that's going to help us form clouds in the atmosphere. When the water droplets form from condensation are very small, they remain suspended in the atmosphere. And while they're suspended in the atmosphere, then we're going to collect millions and millions of these droplets are going to form the clouds that we see in the sky. Or if perhaps these clouds are a lot lower, we're going to see them as fog on the ground level. So when we have really heavy fog, that's basically kind of like a cloud sitting at a much lower level. It's just kind of a collection of water droplets, okay? Once conditions are right, and that includes both temperature and atmospheric pressure, then those small droplets are going to start making their way to Earth in the form of precipitation. So here we just have a white fluffy cloud. Over here we have a cloud that looks more like a thunderstorm cloud, and that is going to start producing precipitation that is going to come back down to Earth. Again, conditions have to be right, because just because you have evaporation, that means water moving up into the atmosphere. If the conditions didn't have to be right, then it would rain all the time, right? We would get evaporation, and then that water would just fall, it would collect and it would condensate, and then it would fall back down. And we know that's not the case. Sometimes that water goes up into the air, and then winds carry it somewhere else, and it rains somewhere else. Or it just continues to carry it, and it never goes through condensation, and it rains far, far away from where it was originally picked up. So those conditions have to be right. Those smaller droplets are going to continue to condense until they get larger droplets, which are heavy enough to fall to the earth. And it's not always rain, depending again on the conditions and where you're located. It could be rain, it could be snow, it could be sleet, it could be hail, it could be freezing drizzle, it could be all different kinds of combinations of precipitation. But that's all forms of water, whether it's frozen or a snowflake or water. So once you have your precipitation bringing the water back down, you're going to have surface runoff. And surface runoff is essentially where you're going to be, the earth is going to absorb, the ground's going to absorb a lot of the precipitation, but that water is eventually going to seek the lowest level. So it's going to flow downhill, right, like what we see here. It's going to flow downhill and find rivers and streams, and eventually a lot of those rivers are going to find their way into larger rivers. The tributaries are going to lead to bigger rivers, and then those big rivers are going to make their way to the ocean. So the ground's going to absorb what it can, and plants are going to take in what they need, but there's going to be considerable runoff, especially in a heavy rain, and all of that water is going to find the lowest level that it can possibly get to, right? So it's going to come down out of the mountains, it's going to find a valley, those valleys are going to have rivers, and then I said, like, it's either going to wind up in a lake, or it's going to wind up going all the way to the ocean. Again, this is how we keep the ocean levels where they're at, because ultimately most of that water, in one way or another, a great deal of it is going to find its way back to the ocean. And that's important because the ocean is where a lot of evaporation takes place. And we need evaporation. We need water in the atmosphere. That's just part of a healthy atmosphere. So, if water's evaporating out of the oceans and then surface runoff is not bringing it back, that's going to create a problem, because we're going to start to see ocean levels dropping considerably. Another thing that can happen in the water cycle is what we call percolation, or sometimes we refer to as infiltration, and that is where the rainwater soaks into the ground. So we have a system here where we're actually seeing below these bodies of water where we're going to create underground reservoirs of water. Okay, it's going to infiltrate into the ground, into the underlying rock layers, into the underlying soil layers. Depending on what your ground area looks like, this may just create aquifers, which are basically like big underground reservoirs, or if your area is pretty heavy with limestone or another type of rock similar to that, then you may start carving out what we call karst topography, and you may have caves and things like that. So you're going to basically start carving pathways underground through this infiltration. Some of the water is going to stay there as groundwater, and it's going to be there in the aquifers, and it's going to be pulled up as the area starts to dry out. Other areas are this water is going to make its way back to the surface, and this is what we would see at a spring, right? So a spring is an area where you've got fresh water coming out of the ground, usually from very deep, from several hundred feet, and it's pushing that groundwater back up that percolated there after the runoff. So the percolation plays a really important role, like I said, in feeding our groundwater and then also getting water back to the surface. A lot of our rivers and things like that are spring fed, right? They just start at the spring, and then that creates a river. So Groundwater is really important too because this is where a lot of our filtering happens. This is a natural filtration process. As the water moves through rock, as it moves through different sediments and things like that, a lot of the impurities are taken out of the water. So that's why spring water, most commonly it was fresh from the spring, is going to be pretty pure water. It's a lot of the impurities have been taken out of it. You don't really have to worry about a lot of the chemicals and things like that. So when you find a spring, chances are it's probably a pretty good source of fresh water. So if you come across a spring, you always want to test your water to make sure that the pH is right and that sort of thing. But most of the time when you come across a spring, that's going to be a pretty good idea, or it's going to give you a pretty good idea that you're drinking some clean water. So I told you that we'd come back to a different form of evaporation, and what we're talking about next is it's still evaporation, but it has a specific name, and that's called transpiration. Transpiration is where the leaves themselves, or the plants themselves, are releasing water. Okay, so the plants absorb water through their root systems, and then the root systems and the transport systems within the plant are going to pull that water up. But as the sun shines, those leaves are going to have to release water, and they're going to be releasing water vapor. So transpiration is where the water vapor is coming out of the leaves. Where you have areas that are very, very densely populated with plants, the rainforest, okay, that's why it rains all the time. You have so much vegetation there that is undergoing this process of transpiration, right? As we mentioned before, I said most of the time it doesn't just go up, and if the conditions aren't right, that water is going to move on. Well, in a tropical rainforest, there's so much transpiration happening, the water goes up, and there's so much of it that it collects, it condenses, and it rains back down. So in a tropical rainforest, that's where you may have a situation where it rains 3 or 4 times a day, because that same water is just going up and coming down and going up and coming down. Most places on the planet are not that populated. They're not that populated with plants, so you don't have that much transpiration happening, right? You may live in a pretty heavily forested area, but unless you live in a tropical rainforest, you're not going to see that type of rain all of the time. So, and so that kind of brings us back, right? That's a form of evaporation, which brings us back, and we've kind of completed our cycle. Again, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, ground runoff, percolation, evaporation. Okay, so again, this is just going to continually move and continue to supply water to plants, to animals, to all organisms on Earth, making life possible. I'll see you next time.